We have with us today Ashifi Gogo. Ashifi is the founder and CEO of Sproxil, a very unique company, a social enterprise that engages in making sure that patients receive high-quality medicines in developing countries. Ashifi, welcome to the William Davidson Institute and to Ann Arbor.
Thank you.
Ashifi, I wanted to start by asking you, a lot of PhD students who graduate in engineering, science, technology, business, when they finish their graduate work, they think about working for a large corporation, a research lab. And as I understand, you went on a different route of becoming entrepreneurial, that too with a social enterprise, something which impacts the world. So tell us a little bit more about what drove you to pick this over doing something which is considered more conventional for PhDs in engineering.
Sure. So even as an undergraduate, I always wanted to see the fruit of my labor impact society in my lifetime. That was sort of my yardstick. It had to happen in my lifetime. So I majored in math and physics as an undergrad, and I looked at the path in which I was going, and I realized it's not going to happen in my lifetime because I was too much involved in the theory as opposed to practical. So I went into engineering for my PhD work, and even then realized that with an engineering degree, you could end up with a job that doesn't really impact people directly in one's lifetime. And so I decided to get entrepreneurial. The best way to carry your ideas out of the classroom into the market and see impact is quite literally to do it yourself. So the Dartmouth Engineering School had this new program that allowed PhD students to take their research and turn it into ventures, into impact-generating vehicles. And I was the first PhD fellow that came out of the Dartmouth Innovation Program, which has helped at this stage turn PhD students into entrepreneurs or become more entrepreneurial in what they do traditionally. And so that's brought me quite a good amount of joy. That I'm seeing impact from my work in my lifetime, and it's a dream come true.
Very good, exciting. So tell us a little bit more about the genesis of the idea behind Sproxil. How did you land on thinking about counterfeit medicines and scratch cards and mobile phones? How did all this come to you?
Sure. And so in 2006, I was working with a colleague on tracking organic products from developing nations to developed ones. So the idea was when you walk into a specialty organic product shop, how do you know your organic tomatoes are actually organic and you're paying extra? And perhaps you may want to know if they're fair trade as well. So the idea was to put 2D barcodes on organic products where they're grown and have them checked in, say, a Whole Foods or a specialty organic shop. Went to a couple of business plan competitions, won some money, and got zero market traction because people who walked into organic shops trusted the brands to do their homework and never sell them, I guess, inorganic tomatoes. And so we had a hammer and we're looking for a nail. The nail came in the form of counterfeit meds, where people in developing nations didn't always trust that they were getting the right drugs from their chemists or pharmacists. And so by tweaking the technology a bit, instead of using 2D barcodes, using scratch-off labels, which are more accessible in those regions, instead of using scanning kiosks, using cell phones, which are more accessible in those regions as well, we're able to find our nail in counterfeit meds and eventually scale up. And so by and large, by looking at the trust relationship between vendor and purchaser, we've been able to design a solution that allows the trust to be built in regions that have inherently low trust.
Great, and when we think of the quality of medicines, for example, here in the United States, we think that the Food and Drug Administration is the one who will make sure that the medicines that we buy from our retail pharmacies are of high quality. Mm-hmm. And we let them manage the whole process of ensuring quality and things like that. And as I understand, your technology puts this into the hands of the consumers for them to verify whether a drug is of high quality or not, if it's falsified or counterfeit. So how do the regulatory authorities view the role of your technology? Do they view this as encroaching on something they are mandated to do? Do they always view you as partners, and how do you manage that relationship?
Sure, that's a very good question. So if you walk into the average regulatory office in a number of these African countries, you see that they're swamped. There's very little resources that have been dedicated to a very large problem. Very leaky borders, insufficiently trained technical staff, or just an insufficient number of these technically savvy staff in those countries. And so by and large, they could do with any support that they can get. And that's the way they see our solution, as a way in which we can support them to actually be more efficient at the work that you're doing, so that they could reach more people and greater fulfill the mandates that's been entrusted on them by their governments. And so by working with these governments, they're very happy to use our technology as a means to enhance their productivity. And we're not very selfish about assigning the benefits of success, right? So we share very easily the benefits of success with the government, and these come through media representation. So governments are very easily able to say, look at what we're doing in these markets by safeguarding the health of consumers, putting the power of authentication in the hands of consumers with a technical partner, and we're happy to support governments as they put across that message.
So this role typically is what is called as a public sector role, which means by ensuring quality of medicines, you're creating a public good, and the public good is typically paid by taxpayer monies or by government grants. And as I understand, your company is a for-profit enterprise, and it doesn't rely on the regulatory authority paying you, but you have a different revenue model. So could you explain to us how, by putting this into the hands of the consumer, the aspect of verifying quality, you could invent a different business model or different revenue model?
Sure. So there are multiple benefits that come out of ensuring that patients get high-quality drugs all the time. These benefits, some fall at the feet of governments and the public, and some also fall at the feet of private enterprises, brand owners, generic drug manufacturers, and so on. So by aligning interests very well, we've been able to develop a business model that charges the government $0 and allows the brand owners to reap commercial benefits out of the investments that they make in adopting our technology, such that patients on the streets can now have greater assurance that products that they're buying are from the right source and are made in the right manner. So by making sure that the ecosystem has interests that are well aligned, the model that we have, where we don't charge governments, but work with brand owners to cover the cost of technology adoption, such that consumers can text for free, we've been able to successfully roll this model out in Nigeria. We're in the process of expanding to many more countries where we already have staff on the ground. So we'll be looking forward to more announcements of successful launches in these other countries as we scale the model beyond the success story that we have right now.
Great. And I think a lot of us, when we think about counterfeit medicines, we always hear that those who make counterfeit medicines are always one step ahead of the anti-counterfeiting technology. So, we used to have holograms before that manufacturers had, and then the cost of making and printing holograms became very low, and then the counterfeiters could add them as well as the original manufacturers could. So are you worried constantly about the fact of this catch-up game that counterfeiters are playing? Are they going to be able to break your technology in some ways? How does that work?
Sure. And so in designing the technology, we spent quite a bit of time looking at what technology solutions work in the markets that we were interested in. So we're mainly interested in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and we're rolling out over time. One thing about technology is that when it's working well, you don't hear much about it. It's of a silent benefit in the background. Wherever when your computer crashes, that's when people get quite upset, right? So it takes a while to figure out what technologies are working well and how you can sort of enhance them to serve new purposes. So in our case, the cell phone voucher recharge system It's made trillions of dollars for cell phone companies where consumers can go out on the streets in these developing nations, buy a little voucher, and load, say, $2 of talk time on their cell phone. That has worked perfectly well for telecom companies. And because it hasn't crashed or imploded, nobody really talks about it, but it's a success story. So by leveraging that existing consumer habit of seeing a voucher and scratching, expecting to see a 12 to 16-digit code, knowing that they have to key it in somewhere and then get some response, we've been able to take that and then add a new use for that user habit. And that's basically embedded in the solution that we have. And so for counterfeiters to try to defeat our solution, they're basically going to have to try to defeat what cell phone companies rely on to conduct business in these markets, which is the scratch-off vouchers. And it's actually more commercially interesting to fake a telephone scratch-off voucher than it would be to counterfeit a drug, fake a label, and then try to sell the drug and the label together. So by and large, we're sort of protected by these multinational giants who have lower-hanging fruits for counterfeiters in the marketplace.
Very interesting. And you said the consumers would scratch and key in the code. So I can understand if I live in Lagos or in Abuja, where I have sufficient awareness about the fact that, well, I have to verify, and this is a technology that I can use to verify. But if I live in very rural, remote parts of Nigeria or Kenya or India, the places that your company is active in, as a consumer or as a patient, I may not even know that I need to verify the quality and there is a mechanism in place. So how do people who live in fairly remote parts come to know about your technology, about your company, and therefore text the code?
So to address issues of low literacy, we actually have multiple ways in which people can check, right? So assuming people know how to check, and I'll address that in a second, they can also call into the call center. Some people who aren't very comfortable with their new cell phones or can do SMS very easily can scratch the panel and call into a call center, speak their favorite local dialect and get a response in their local dialect. So it addresses the needs of people who aren't very comfortable using SMS. And the governments that we partner with spend quite a bit of time on raising awareness about the solution. And this works very well with existing government initiatives to help with medical literacy in rural areas. So some governments have programs that help expand literacy of medical issues in rural areas. And increasingly, we're beginning to work with the drug retail points. We started working directly with the end consumers because the end consumer has the most to lose if they take a fake pill, right? They could lose their lives or be handicapped in some way or other. Now we're working with the retail points, the pharmacists, and so on, so that they could do this on behalf of patients who are unable to verify on their own or are handicapped by literacy. So that they can access the technology as well. And as the pharmacists and the stockists begin to do this on behalf of patients, we could keep going up the supply chain so that everyone from the manufacturer down is assured of having good quality products irrespective of their location.
Great. And one other thing which we hear a lot about the counterfeit business, I remember Dora Keneally from NAFTAC telling me stories about the many attempts on her life and how this is a business that is deeply entrenched with a crime nexus in Nigeria, and anybody who tries to counter that has significant risk. So do you feel threatened? Do you worry about such things, given that you are putting a lot of people out of business, and some of them could be fairly large businesses in India, Nigeria, China, other places?
Sure. So personal security and the security of our staff is something that we pay very close attention to. However, we're doing something quite different in our instance. The old regime of enforcing anti-counterfeiting measures revolved around sort of very dynamic people or people who wouldn't give in to the demands of counterfeiters. And so there's a bit more of a one-to-one direct confrontation that you have with sort of a very good regulator. and a strong counterfeiter. Right now, the power is entirely disseminated among consumers. So it's one counterfeiter versus 150 million people who are voting with their consuming power whether they would like to support a counterfeiter or not. And it's very hard, no matter how powerful a counterfeiter is, to fight a whole country of consumers who are now enlightened and decided not to buy a specific product, right? So we leave it to market forces to decide. If consumers really want to consume counterfeit products when they know the difference, they'll likely go ahead and do so, right? But if they know that counterfeits aren't good for them, the demand for counterfeits would go down, and then hence the supply would go down naturally, and there really is no way to stop such a situation. Our technology works with telecom companies. We've partnered with very large companies. And so by and large, it's well entrenched in pillars of society that are very hard to bring down. And so it gives us a bit more confidence than we typically would have with sort of a solo effort where folks can target sort of the nexus of enforcement and hoping to sort of bring down the whole anti-counterfeiter environment so that they could keep going on with business as usual. The times have changed.
I think a lot of people would want to do something like this where they can solve a social problem and use technology and social enterprise. But oftentimes they face the difficulty, the challenge of not being able to convince an investor, not being able to convince an investment group that this is not just for social good, but also is a profitable business, is also going to bring some returns. So how challenging was it for you and your colleagues in your company to convince a large group of investors to say this is something that will work, is needed, and is going to drive social impact?
It's always tricky starting from scratch, especially when you have great results to show, but it's in a far, far away land where, compared to where investors typically reside in, say, Western Europe or the U.S. And so we bootstrapped through the angel round, so the startup phase. We used our own funds. We were able to get a few grants from USAID, NCAA, and a couple other organizations, the Clinton Foundation, and then used our initial results backed with a strategy that we had developed with a program that goes with the technology, presented these to a number of investors, and we had a couple of options that we could have gone with as we're seeking investment to scale up. So by and large, it's not an easy road to take, but it's quite a fulfilling one to be able to look at the number of SMSs we get every day, knowing that thousands of people have used our service today to avoid being ripped off at the pharmacy. It certainly allows you to go to bed with a big smile on your face. So even though it's not a very easy road to go down, it's certainly a very rewarding one to do so. And it's always useful to remember that even when you're delivering social value, you're still delivering value. And people at the bottom of the pyramid recognize value, and depending on the pricing mechanism, could likely pay for some aspects of the value, if not all of it. Right? So it helps to go into such situations with a business mindset. Even though the pricing may be not as interesting as it would have been if it was for a fully commercial entity, keep in mind the business principles as they would fundamentally enhance the chance of getting funding down the road.
Many of our business school students, our students in different schools across campus, are very interested in becoming social entrepreneurs themselves, starting companies like yours. And what message would you have for them in terms of working with governments? Because many of these roles require a very strong interaction with your government counterparts. And that is a skill which is not easy to acquire in the classroom. That's something you learn by doing. So what message would you have? How do you deal with government counterparts? And is there a recipe for success that you would share with us on that?
Well, what we've done that's worked so far is to recognize and respect the government's position in these markets. They're typically very well-meaning, good-natured people who simply don't have enough to work with to achieve the goals that they have or have been presented to them, right? So if you can help these government officials become more efficient at what they're supposed to be doing, or what they're doing already, you're likely going to strike a very good friendship with the government officials, which will allow you to successfully implement solutions. Actually, let me scratch that, because saying friendship with government officials is not very good. So let me take that again. So basically, the question is, how do you work with governments? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So in order to work with governments quite well, one of the strategies that we've employed that's very good, and that's so far delivered results, is to partner with the governments, recognizing that there's a bit of a shortfall in the resources that have typically been allocated to them, and the expectations, the results that they're supposed to deliver. So if one is able to provide results working with the government, and one is flexible enough to allow the government to take some credit for the results that they're sort of jointly working with a private entrepreneur to achieve, one can typically work well with governments without running into any challenges. We've had a very good experience so far in the markets that we work with in Africa and in India as well, and we keep using the same strategy to work smoothly with governments in those regions.
And then Sproxil is now in multiple countries. It's scaling up. Many other countries are starting Sproxils. Use and technology is being adopted much faster than you would have imagined when the Nigeria pilot started. So if things go as per plan, what is next for you? Where would Sproxil be?
So Sproxil's role in helping safeguard the health of consumers, of governments, lies in our ability to bring partners together to agree on this issue, which is a bit sticky, and then deliver results to the guy on the streets, right? Central to that is our ability to process a lot of data and information that comes in from these multiple parties. So we retain the position of issuing out these codes and validating them and providing intelligence to both brand owners and the governments for them to do their natural duties, figure out where these fakes are being produced through investigations, and eventually prosecute those at fault so that we can have fewer and fewer counterfeiters on the streets. As we continue to roll out more and more subsidiaries in various countries, it's likely that we'll retain our role as the processing house, the intelligence generating center, so that we can pass this information on to the enforcers, who can then go out and make sure that action is taken in the field. And when consumers begin to see that my phone call led to a big bust, they'll certainly be delighted, and they'll keep using the service, which would more or less put some checks on the growth of the issues of counterfeiting in those markets. So we see ourselves as a data company in this regard. And as we start working with non-pharmaceutical products as well, there's a lot of data that will be gathered on consumer preferences, which we can use to help enhance the way manufacturing companies make products for these regions where it's very hard to get data on consumer preferences.
Very exciting, Ashifi. I know we can talk about so many things that interest us and overlap with the kind of work we do here at the Davidson Institute. But I would like to thank you again for sharing some of your insights with us and for coming here to Ann Arbor. Thank you.
Thank you.